Hi, I'm Chad Walker, author of SIGMATA, The Signal Kills Fascists. The goal of this video series is to teach you how to play SIGMATA in just a few minutes. You can watch this video to determine if the game is right for you, or you can share this video with your players so they'll be ready to play as soon as you start gaming. In this video, specifically, I'll be teaching you how to play what the game calls evasion scenes. So evasion scenes are where the player characters, called receivers, are either trying to reach a destination without being detected, or alternatively, trying to reach a destination without being captured. One example of an evasion scene might be where the receivers are stealthily infiltrating a regime R&D facility in order to sabotage a technology prototype. As another example of an evasion scene, there might be a scene where the receivers are fleeing a regime dragnet supported by bloodhounds and search helicopters and spotlights, perhaps after their safe house got raided. For the purposes of illustration, I'm going to use 2 of the 6 pre-generated characters that you'll find in the back of the book, but are also available as free print-friendly downloads. On the left, we have Taprack, and on the right, we have Siren. Now there's a lot going on with these character sheets, but we're not going to be talking about most of this stuff today. In fact, we're just going to be using the very top portion of each sheet. So let's zoom in and take a look. Okay, here we see Taprack's actual name, Marcus Abrams, as well as a brief description for his surface and his story. Think of surface as the first impression people have of a receiver. It's not an informed opinion, and instead typically based on demographics and all the biases and junk that can come with that. Story, on the other hand, those are the true details of a receiver's personality and experience. The stuff that you wouldn't know unless you actually took time to get to know them, or if they actually chose to reveal this information on their own. Below that, we have the receiver's quad-core processor, which is this guy, and the tactics matrix, which is this stuff right here. Let's start with the processors. Each receiver is defined in part by 4 processors: aggression, guile, judgment, and valor, each of which are rated on a scale of 1 to 5, where 1 is bad, 3 is average, and 5 is good. Processors determine what dice a player will be rolling when they play SIGMATA, and what tactics and powers a receiver is best suited to use. Next to quad-core processor is the tactics matrix. This matrix lists all the tactics that are available to a receiver during scenes of combat, evasion, or intrigue. And today we're going to be focusing just on the evasion tactics in the middle right here, which are rush, sneak, fade, and deny. To the right of the tactics matrix, we see the effects of each tactic. In fact, this portion of the character sheet was designed so you can read each row from left to right. So I'm going to circle this one on the bottom right here, and let's read that across. So we can see that Taprack has 5 Valor, which his player will reference when using the suppress, deny, or support tactics. We also see that all 3 of those tactics permit Taprack to reduce the exposure of a comrade by 1 point per success rolled, regardless of what scene type we're talking about. So let's take a second to review Taprack's utility in an evasion scene based on his processor scores. So his outstanding Valor score right here, that means he's very adept at using the deny tactic. So deny is doing whatever it takes to ensure that your comrades don't get caught during a scene of evasion. For example, it could be the act of being a spotter and waving comrades through when the coast is clear. Alternatively, it could be the act of creating a loud distraction that draws the attention away from a comrade that is about to be caught. His low judgment score right here means he's not very good at using the fade tactic. So fade is doing whatever it takes to ensure that you, the receiver, won't get caught. So for example, it could be the act of hiding in a broom closet and holding your breath, waiting for that sentry to slowly creep by. Alternatively, it could be the act of sticking to the shadows and patiently waiting for the perfect time to rush through the gauntlet of searchlights that are crisscrossing across the courtyard. It's pretty clear that Taprack is really great at protecting his comrades, but when it comes to self-preservation, not so much. Let's contrast Taprack with another character, Siren. So Siren, she has a pretty good guile score, which means she's pretty good at using the sneak tactic. So sneak is a cautious method of advancing towards a destination during an evasion scene. For example, it could be the act of picking locks, or belly crawling through ventilation shafts, or tiptoeing past a sentry who has their back turned, looking elsewhere. Alternatively, it could be the act of quietly sneaking up on that sentry, putting him in a sleeper hold, and then dragging him out of sight. Her low aggression score, right here, means that she's not very adept at using the rush tactic. So in a scene of evasion, rush is making reckless progress towards something, no matter the risk of detection. So for example, it could be the act of sprinting through that long corridor or a courtyard and diving behind cover right before the spotlight illuminates the area. Alternatively, it could be the act of exploding from the bushes to violently dismantle a sentry with your blade, striking so fast and so hard that he doesn't even have time to cry out for help. It's pretty clear that Siren is good at making slow, steady progress, but seems to lack the courage to execute those more high-risk, high-reward maneuvers. So anytime the table is playing an evasion scene, you're going to be using the evasion sheet, also available as a print-friendly download. So this looks pretty busy at first glance, but it's actually super simple. Let's break down all the different parts. So at the top of the sheet here, there's going to be two things that a game master is going to fill out prior to a scene starting. So we'll talk about that in 1 second. And then the rest of these entries, each one of these you use for a single individual receiver. So for example, we would just add Siren right here. And now we can track Siren's progress in the scene, signified by the waypoints here, and also track her exposure, which is the likelihood of her getting caught during this scene. All right, so like a good game master, I've filled in the top of the evasion sheet to get ready for my players. So there's two things we'll talk about here. So one is the scene's level of alarm, which is right here, which I've determined is 3. We'll talk about that. And then the scene's location. So in this case, it looks like it's a corporate headquarters. There's also this conceptual path. We'll talk about that in a second too. Okay, so obviously the location of the scene is a corporate headquarters. Let's just assume that the receivers have been tasked with breaking into an executive's office to acquire plans or something like that. Maybe determine if he's actually an ally or neutral or working for the regime, something like that. So instead of drawing a map, the GM is going to list a conceptual path towards the player's goal. In this case, we see at the end of this conceptual path, there's the executive office that they get to. But prior to that, it looks like there's some things they have to traverse before they get there. So here we see that the receivers have to penetrate the facility's perimeter to make it inside of the lobby of the corporate headquarters, then get past the lobby's defenses to take the elevator to a cube farm, and then finally navigate that cube farm to make it to the executive's office. Now at the top right is the alarm. So again, this thing has been set at 3, and that's very important. So alarm represents the overall level of sentry alertness and security controls and hazards and kind of pursuer doggedness that permeates the scene of evasion. It's usually rated as 2 or a 3, sometimes higher. We'll talk about that another time. But if a location is defended by, let's say, I don't know, a handful of neo-Nazi hooligans and like their favorite junkyard dog and maybe some barbed wire fences and stuff like that, the alarm is probably rated at 2. But if the location is defended by, let's say, freedom frisk regulars with SMGs, and there's a bunch of CCTV cameras and motion sensors, and maybe there's some gunships flying overhead performing overwatch, the alarm is probably going to be rated at 3 or higher. Okay, so here's our filled out sheet. This sheet will track each receiver's waypoints and exposure in a central location, so this information is available to everyone at the table. So for example, Siren's player could look at the sheet and see that, oh, maybe Taprak's exposure is very high. He's about to get in trouble. I better do something to save him. Or Taprak's player could look at Siren and say, well, her exposure is low and her waypoints are very high. She's almost made it to the goal. I better focus on protecting myself for a couple scenes. So waypoints represent a receiver's progress towards the scene's goal, while exposure represents the likelihood that they will get detected or captured during the scene. And this is super important, tracking exposure, because during an evasion scene, if any of the receivers end their turn with 10 or more exposure, the entire mission is blown. It means that everyone gets caught, not just that one receiver, and it's time to switch to a plan B, which is probably not ideal. So while we're here, let's take a look at the shapes and the arrows here. So by shapes and arrows, I'm talking about these arrows that are pointing this way and this way. We see that they exist both in the location tracker as well as on the waypoint tracker for every character. So what's going on here? Well, it looks like it matches the location information that the Game Master established. So we see here that if Siren has between 0 and 5 points, she's outside of the building still, so still in the perimeter. If she has between 6 and 10 waypoints, right here, well, that means she's navigating the lobby at that point in the scene, and so on and so forth. The table now has shared narrative understanding of where everyone is physically during this scene, and they can reference that when it's time to tell their story. All right, everything's in place, so let's go ahead and start an evasion scene. So scenes are organized in turns, and the Game Master always goes first during a turn. In an evasion scene, the Game Master increases each receiver's exposure by a level equal to the scene's alarm. So in this case, we see that the alarm is 3, and the Game Master has increased each receiver's exposure by 3 points. It was at 0 at the beginning of the scene, but now it's at 3. Then the Game Master takes a minute or two describing all the people and things that are making life difficult for the receivers. So what's actually causing everyone's exposure to go up? So for example, the Game Master might narrate Freedom Fist regulars patrolling the perimeter, illuminating spaces with their flashlight, and periodically checking in over the radio. It's all clear, that kind of thing. They're slowly turning towards the receiver though. That is why their exposure is going up. So after the Game Master has spoken, now it's the player's turn to act. So the players can go in any order they wish, and in this case we're going to have Siren go first. Even though it's not her best tactic available, she's going to use the rush tactic right here. So rush adds 5 waypoints to Siren, plus an additional waypoint for every success she rolls, but it also adds 5 exposure to her. It's a pretty bold move, so let's see how it plays out. Siren's player will now make an operation, or an op, which is what SIGMATA calls a dice roll. When making an op, a player rolls a number of d10s equal to the score of the relevant processor for that tactic being used. So in this case, we see that she'll be using her aggression because she's using the rush tactic and rolling 2d10. She then adds d6s to her roll until she is rolling a total of 5 dice. So in this case, because she's rolling 2d10, we're going to add 3d6 to her hand for a total of 5 dice. Players always roll 5 dice, no matter what, but the higher her processor score, the more those dice will be d10s instead of d6s. When making an op, a player is hoping to score as many successes as possible. A success is a dice result of 6 or higher, noted here, which is a lot easier to do on a D10 as it is a D6. So again, the more D10s you have, the better off you are. A result of 1, on the other hand, on either type of dice is a botch, which is essentially a negative success. So for illustration's sake, let's assume that Siren's player rolled 2 successes and 1 botch. That results in a total of 1 success for her roll. So what does that mean? Well, 5 plus 1 equals 6, meaning Siren has accumulated 6 waypoints, as denoted right here, making it past the perimeter and into the lobby. Her approach was so fast and reckless, however, that her exposure went up by 5. It's now at 8. Remember, the turn started with her exposure at 3, but then she chose the rush tactic, which increases her exposure by 5. So it's gone all the way up to 8. Now that we've documented what happened mechanically, it's time for Siren's player to narrate what happened, making up whatever details she wants to. For example, maybe the player describes Siren timing the patrols that she sees walking by with her wristwatch, and then using a little math to determine the perfect moment to make a mad dash towards the facility's front door. Alternatively, maybe Siren has spent most of her time just smashing the lock on a back door, or maybe executing some type of parkour monkey climb to a third-story window or something. You see, SIGMATA is designed to have the players assume the director's role during their turn. All those little details of patrols, locked doors, prop windows, you name it. Yeah, it's certainly informed by whatever criteria the game master set up at the beginning of the scene, but everything can and should be invented by the player to support the type of story that they want to tell. Don't ask the game master permission, just tell your story. And by doing so, you're actually giving the other players and the game master narrative clues for when it's their turn to speak. For example, let's assume that Siren kicked in the back door and made her way inside the facility. Maybe Taprak wants to play with that narration during his turn. So just for illustration purposes, we're going to go ahead and assume that Takrak is using the sneak tactic to quietly sneak towards the back door. He makes his roll, gets 2 successes, and acquires 2 waypoints, which I've circled there. His player will then narrate this slow, steady approach to the back door any way he wants to. Once all the players have gone, it's time for the next turn. So remember, the Game Master always goes first. So every receiver has their exposure rise by a level equal to the scene's alarm. Uh-oh, Siren is in some serious trouble. Look at this. Her exposure is at 11 now. Remember, it was at 8, but it goes up 3 every turn, so now she's at 11. And if any receiver ends a turn with 10 or more exposure, they'll be detected and the entire operation will be blown. Incorporating this into the drama, the Game Master narrates how one of the exterior patrols is slowly making its way towards the door that Siren kicked open. Unfortunately, Siren wasn't able to close the damaged door completely, so there's a little sliver of light that's shining through, and it's about to be noticed by the patrol. It's now the player's turn. Siren's player is considering some evasive action because she's in some real trouble. But first, it's time for Taprak to put some of his sheepdog tendencies to use. Powered by his high Valor score, he's definitely going to use the deny tactic to try to reduce the exposure of his comrade. So for illustration purposes, let's go ahead and assume that he rolled 4 successes, pushing Siren's exposure from 11 back to 7. His player describes how Taprak picks up a rock and he eyes a dumpster 40 yards away. And with a big windup, he hurls this rock as hard as he can to hit the dumpster. There's this loud, horrible racket that causes that patrol that was heading towards the door to suddenly about face. And, they have their hands on their sidearms looking at each other. And they're probably creeping towards that dumpster now instead of towards the door that Siren accidentally left open. So Siren's exposure was reduced by 4 points. She's no longer in danger of getting caught this turn, but she's not taking any chances. Her player decides to use the fade tactic to reduce her own exposure even more. If she scores a few successes, her player narrates how she returns to the door to shut it fully, and then waits patiently for her comrades to join her. So after her successful fade op reducing her exposure further, it's time for a new turn. The Game Master increases each receiver's exposure by 3 points and then kicks off their narration on why the drama is unfolding that way. We're mostly done with this illustration, but if we look at where the receivers are at this point, it almost looks like it's a losing battle. They keep accumulating exposure, but they haven't really accumulated a lot of waypoints. Are they going to get caught? Well, remember, the receivers are FM radio-powered cybernetic revolutionaries. They have performance-enhancing implants called blades, incredible superpowers called subroutines, useful equipment called peripherals, and a slew of other options at their disposal, not the least of which is support from one of their allied factions. In an evasion scene, for example, the players can always leverage the help of vanguards, who are members of the game's socialist faction and willing to execute subversive actions against their employer when the resistance needs their help. So there might be a receptionist, a janitor, or a working stiff inside the building that just might be a vanguard, ready to lend a helping hand when things are looking grim for our heroes. I'll be covering those other topics in later videos. For now, though, hopefully you have an idea on how the game's fundamentals work and how to play a pretty compelling evasion scene. Well, that's it for today. I hope you found this video entertaining and informative. If this game seems like it's a right fit for you and your friends, you can head on over to DriveThruRPG and pick up a copy once it's released. Thanks, everybody.